How do you explain? How do you describe a love that goes from east to west?
Hello again. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at Jesus' teachings specifically about marriage. Our text, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate," that comes from Matthew the 19th chapter. And in that chapter, to look at the context, the Pharisees, they come to Jesus and they're trying to test him like they always do. They ask him if it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason, and they want a simple answer so they may pin something against Jesus, but he doesn't give them a simple answer. In verses 4 through 6 he says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Now, there's a few things that we need to make clear before we start this lesson. We're not looking at the idea of marriage according to the U.S. civilization today, or the U.S. Constitution, or what political party says what, or what philosophical viewpoint is versus another. We're not looking at that. We're looking at what the Bible teaches about marriage. We're looking at what God the Father and God the Son teach about this institution. We want to be righteous on the side of God. I personally, I don't care about the Constitution's definition of marriage. I want to teach, and I want to be part of a marriage that is faithful, that is holy in God's sight. So when we look at this, they're asking him specifically about divorce. He doesn't begin teaching them about divorce. He teaches them about marriage and the importance of marriage. He says, "Have you not read?" Now, this is something that should go to the heart of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were very good at knowing the law. They were the teachers. They were the people that you went to if you had a question. They were the lawyers when it came to the law of Moses. He says, "Have you not read?" You should know the answer to this question, guys. You should have read this. And he alludes to chapter 1 and 2 of Genesis when he says, "He who created them from the beginning made them male and female." He's talking about Adam and Eve when God created them and placed them in the Garden of Eden. That's what he's referring to. In the beginning, made them male and female. He says this goes back to the foundation of the world, before the Christian age, before the Jewish age. This goes back to how God, this is the first institution that God established, was this one man, one woman, and that's how life was brought into this earth. They were fruitful, they multiplied, and they did this through this marriage bond with one another. And he said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." God takes these two individuals and makes them a union, makes them a single entity. Now, he's not saying that each one loses their individuality. He says that they become one entity within the framework of marriage. In other words, me and my wife, we are a single entity. Now, each one of us we'll have to work on our faith to God. We're going to have to build our faith and keep our faith in God. We are responsible for ourselves, and we learn that from the book of Ezekiel. We can't answer for someone else's sins, and someone else can't answer for our sins. We have to live righteously and faithfully to God, each individual. But within the confines of marriage, in God's eyes, He looks at me and my wife as one entity. He looks at us as having one flesh, and that's what Jesus says. These two individuals, this man leaves his father and mother, this woman leaves her father and mother, they come together, and in God's eyes, they become one individual, or they become one flesh, they become one entity. Now, you can also note here that the phrase "one flesh," a lot of times in the Old and New Testaments, this refers to sexual intercourse, or sex in general. For some reason or another, Christians and God-fearers for a long time, or in some areas, have taught that sex is unholy or dirty or unclean. That's not true at all. That's not true at all. When you read through the New Testament, read through the Old Testament, that's how God designed. God created us, sexual beings. Sex is holy. Sex is righteous if it's found within the framework that God designed it for. We see within this framework here, in the union of marriage, in the bond of marriage between one man and one woman, that's where God designed sex to be holy and to be righteous. And that's what Jesus is saying. He says when God has joined these two individuals, what does he say in that last phrase? What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now it's difficult phrasing, and you'll see different translations translate this a different way. But it's an imperative statement. Okay? It's a command. I had coaches in high school, if they told me to get out there and they said run 5 laps, that was not open for debate. I had to run 5 laps. That's what Jesus is saying here. This is not a situation where he's saying, it's okay if they do it. He says no. What God has joined together, do not separate. God created these two individuals when they became married, when they became husband and wife, he made the two individuals one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, do not separate it. Well, they ask him, why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? This, of course, coming from the old law, Moses did do this. Now listen to what Jesus says. He says, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. He goes back to the law of Moses. He says, God never designed you to do this, but because your hearts are hard, and he says this in a lot of different places. Like back in Matthew 5 through 7 on the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about giving vows, he says you shouldn't give a vow towards anything. You shouldn't grade your vows on what you take a vow on, whether it's the temple, whether it's the earth, whether it's your head, whatever. He says let your yes be yes and your no be no. Be truthful, be honest. And when he talks about summing up the law and the prophets, he says love your neighbor, or love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, your mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the law and the prophets. All those centuries of writings and all those different prophets and all those different speakers from God, all of that can be summed up in those two commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. You don't want someone to lie to you. Don't lie to them. That's what he was talking about with giving vows. That your yes be yes, your no be no. It's a hard issue. You want to serve God because you want to serve God. You want to serve man because you want to serve man and God. He says, because your hearts were hard, Moses gave you this allowance. But he says, again, from the beginning, how God designed it in the Garden of Eden, it was not so. And he escalates the gravity of the command from the previous few verses in verses 4 through 6, when he says, what God has joined together, do not separate. He goes on to give you the gravity of the sin of not listening to Jesus in that command. He says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, or a better translation, if you read the King James or the American Standard Version, the word is fornication. Sexual immorality is a lot broader than fornication. Fornication is an unlawful sexual act. I am committing a sexual act, either intercourse or fill in the blank, with someone else who's not my spouse. That is the connotation to this word that's used here, that fornication or sexual immorality. If I divorce my spouse for some other reason, whether it's unreconcilable differences, whether they burnt the meatloaf, whether we just can't get along anymore, whether XYZ. If I divorce her for some other reason besides her cheating on me and committing a sexual act with someone else, and I marry again, I commit adultery. He says the only thing that breaks that marriage bond is sexual immorality or fornication. And if I marry someone after divorcing them and fornication has not been committed, if that's the case, and I marry again, I commit adultery. Now, adultery is not the same thing as fornication. Adultery is the sin of breaking a marriage bond. And let's not be too uncertain about this. Adultery is a sin. And Jesus is teaching them. In Jesus' day, if you were caught in the act of adultery, if you were having sex with someone who was not your spouse, according to the law of Moses, you were stoned. Okay? That was according to the law that God gave Moses. So, if you committed that sexual sin and you were caught, you were killed. Okay? Jesus is showing the gravity of not following that command. What God has joined together, He's made these two individuals one flesh. If you separate that, He says in the verses 4 through 6, don't separate it. But if you do, and you separate it for some other reason besides fornication, and you marry again, you're committing the sin of adultery. Now, listen to how his disciples, I'm talking about Jesus' disciples, not the Pharisees' disciples, listen to how they respond. If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. In other words, if I can't divorce her because we don't get along anymore, because I don't like that individual anymore, if that is the case, if I can't divorce them and marry someone else, it's better not to marry. That's the statement they make to Jesus. That's showing the gravity of what Jesus said. What God has joined together, do not separate it. And if you do separate it and you divorce them for some other reason besides fornication, you commit adultery if you marry again. Then the disciples of Jesus see this and say, well, it's better not to marry. Well, Jesus, he doesn't say, well, each one's heart's different and it depends on a certain... No, that's not what he says. He says not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. In other words, if you want to be a follower of God, you'll listen to what he has to say. If you don't want to be a follower of God, if you don't care about committing adultery, if you don't care about breaking that bond that God has joined together, if you don't care about that, don't follow God. Jesus doesn't change his statement. He doesn't change the connotations to his statement. He doesn't change the rationale or the gravity. He doesn't change any of that. He says you either receive this or you don't. It's up to you. Other verses we can look at is Matthew 5:32, Mark 10:11 through 12, Luke 16:18. Now, the Matthew 5 text, that comes from Sermon on the Mount. Now, the difference between what he says in Matthew 19 and Matthew chapter 5 is he adds on something. He says, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, he's already said, if you divorce your spouse for any other reason besides fornication and you marry again, you commit adultery. But not only you. If she marries again, she commits adultery. She commits the sin of breaking that marriage bond. And whoever she marries commits adultery, commits the sin of breaking that marriage bond. So you see how this sin just kind of flows outward. This sin of adultery, of breaking the law that Jesus has given, where he says, what God has joined together, do not separate. And if you separate it for some other reason besides fornication and you marry again, you commit adultery. Your spouse, if they marry again, they commit adultery. The person they marry commits adultery. Mark 10 says similarly the same thing, except it flip-flops and says if she divorces her husband and marries another one, she commits adultery. So it's looking at also the woman, if she divorces her husband, as well as the man divorcing his wife. And Luke 16:18 says the same type thing as these other two texts. So what can we get from all of this? God created marriage to be between one man, one woman for life. What God has joined together, do not separate. That's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. He says if you do separate it for some other reason besides fornication and you marry again, you commit adultery. Not only you, but the person you marry and the person your spouse marries after that marriage is dissolved, they commit adultery. And you have to ask the question, why? It doesn't matter what piece of paper someone gives some other person. It doesn't matter if you get it from the state of Chicago or the state of Illinois or the U.S. It doesn't matter if you get it from Jamaica, from fill in the blank. It doesn't matter what that piece of paper says. In God's eyes, my wife and me are married. We are joined together. If I divorce her, she divorces me, and either one of us marry, and fornication has not been committed in our relationship, in our marriage, and that's not the reason we got divorced. If we marry again, we commit adultery. We commit the sin of adultery. God's plan was one man, one woman for life. You look at the U.S., we have a 50% divorce rate. Half of all marriages end in divorce. What an amazing thing we could have if we looked at how God looked at marriage. Now, there's other places in the New Testament. You can go to Ephesians chapter 5. You can go to some other books in the New Testament. You can look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and how a husband and a wife should deal with one another to make that marriage as sound and as loving as possible. This message is for everybody, but I want a specific message to Christians right now. If you want a happy marriage, if you want a marriage where you don't have to worry about this issue, marry someone who loves God more than they love you. Because they will look at marriage the same way Jesus looks at marriage. because they're a disciple of Christ. They will look at the marriage bond the way God looks at the marriage bond, the way He established it in Genesis 1 and 2, one man, one woman for life. If you marry someone who understands that and has more faith towards God than they have towards you, you will have a faithful and a loving marriage. Likewise, you as an individual should love God more than you love your spouse. You should understand, men, you should, as Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, you should look at them as someone you should take care of. You should look at them as someone who is a part of your relationship. Ephesians chapter 5, you should submit to one another. Husbands to wives, wives to husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for her. Wives, love your husbands and submit to them as Christ, or as the church submits to Christ. See, and if you look at that marriage, we don't like talking about submission. We don't like talking about, because we are a nation, a civilization of individuality. And you wonder why we have a 50% divorce rate. It's all about me, me, me. That's not what marriage is about. If you want to, and again, this goes back, if you don't want to be a servant of God, if you don't want to serve what Jesus says, if you don't want to listen to what He says, you don't want to be faithful to His commandments, then don't be. If you don't want to receive them, don't receive them. That was His point when His disciple says it's better for a man not to marry. If you can receive it, receive it. If you don't, don't. But if you want to be faithful to God, if you want to be faithful to Christ, you have to submit. Okay? You submit to God, and you also submit to your spouse. You submit to your kids to teach them. You submit to make sure that they, and I'm not talking about let them run over you, I'm talking about loving them enough to discipline them in a way where they will know what's right and what's wrong. It's not easy. But you have to submit to what God instructs us to submit to. I submit to other individuals. I love my neighbor as myself. That is submission. And the problem is, and we look at the divorce rate in many Christians' lives, it's similar. Because we accept the Western culture of marriage as opposed to Jesus's, as opposed to God's culture of marriage. Our problem is selfishness. Love your wife as Christ loved the church. Love your husband as the church loves Christ. If that's what your marriage is hinged on, doesn't matter how much you bicker, doesn't matter how much you fight, you will be able to work through those issues because you know that that individual is important. You know that submission to that individual is important because of the example given to us by our Lord. He didn't have to die on the cross, but He submitted to death that we might have life. When we look at marriage and His instructions on marriage, let's not bend it. Let's not change it. Let's let Him say what He means. I'll finish with this story. Had a guy come to me one time, and we were talking about this specific situation with divorce and remarriage, and he was asking me what my belief on it was. Well, I just read to him Matthew chapter 19, and we talked about that text and talked about Jesus' instructions on that text. Well, we got done with the discussion. He asked me, he says, well, what's your interpretation of that, or what is your how do you look at that? And he kept asking me this, and finally I had to tell him, I'm like, buddy, it doesn't matter what I think about it. It doesn't matter what I believe about it. It doesn't matter how I interpret it. It doesn't change what Jesus says. God designed marriage to be between one man, one woman for life. What God has joined together, do not separate it. And when we look at that principle, when we look at marriage in our culture, and specifically in Christian homes, when we look at marriage, we should look at it exactly how God looked at it in Genesis 1 and 2. We should look at it exactly how Jesus looked at it in Matthew chapter 5 and Mark chapter 10 and Matthew chapter 19 and so on and so forth. We should look at marriage the same way God looks at marriage.